I would like to thank this initiative because I was not interested in social epistemology, and this is a good chance for me to take an interest in it. I do hope that together with you, we can think over and discuss the aspects our society needs. As already mentioned, I will be introducing to you an article produced by Dan Sperber et al. Related to epistemic vigilance. And I do think that in comparison to other discussions, this is a little bit longer. But the fault is not mine, because the article is quite voluminous. I have tried to compress it as much as possible. But since the article included not only aspects of social epistemology, but also there were propositions from other spheres like philosophy of language and so forth and so on. It was really difficult to compress it. So I'm sorry if I would be a little bit longer. Now, every day we are dealing with communication. We are communicating with each other. As a result, we are transmitting information. And throughout this process of transmission, we do develop cultural information. Gorey, Sperber, and Wilson believe that most of communication is open and intended for the communicator and addressee. This is a win-win situation. If this is a win-win situation, then a question arises. What are the aims of information? And here, in terms of addressee and communicator, objectives differ. For the addressee, it is always important to have accurate and proper information, whereas for the communicator, the objective might be different. For the communicator, it is more important to exert some influence. And in this case, the objectives of these two may either coincide or not. So the communicators, in one case, it is important to get adequate and accurate information. On the other case, the objective is to achieve its purposes through transmitting information. We need to address the trustfulness of the sources of information. And the question is whether should we trust others' competencies? And is it important to develop some vigilance vis-a-vis such incompetence? These are the questions Sperber et al. Pronounce, trying to work this through their paper, dwelling mostly on the interaction between vigilance and trust, between comprehension and mind reading, the role of vigilance, the vigilance with regard to information source, vigilance towards information content, epistemic vigilance and its development, and epistemic vigilance and conscious, and so to say, group vigilance. In the first place, it is important to mention what is the definition given by Sperber with regard to epistemic vigilance. He believes that people have biologically built cognitive mechanisms whereby they are able to be vigilant, to reduce, to mitigate, or to balance the risks of being disinformed. The author tries to substantiate that such epistemic vigilance is something inherent to humans. something developed through human evolution with which we can engage and further enhance. What are the interactions between trust and vigilance? The authors have differentiated two propositions, a weaker proposition or hypothesis of trust, which persons develop. Gloria Origi believes that over the course of time, as a result of interaction, people develop certain degree of trust. According to Thomas Ray, Daniel Gilbert, people trust each other, not only as a result of interaction, but also from the moment of starting the interaction. Which are the metaphysical hypotheses underlying these propositions, reductionism and anti-reductionism? By saying reductionism, they mean a specific context, according to each verified and true belief qualifies as a knowledge only in a case when verification is substantiated through such true beliefs which were acquired as a result of direct comprehension or self-apparent principles. So something that we derive from our own experience by using our reasoning. And according to anti-reductionism, trust is not substantiated through any thinking process. Trust is the key source of knowledge. People trust as far as they do not have any reason not to trust. This proposition relates to the earlier weak hypothesis. Here, from the moment of communication, we are using this tool as an argument of anti-reductionism. They speak about natural trust towards use of language. When we master the same language and I'm communicating some information, the words themselves are comprehensible for the interlocutor. And because throughout the time, we already do have some trust, we do trust someone so far as that we haven't encountered any reason for not to trust. Gilbert believes that our mental system accepts information automatically before researching and potentially rejecting it. And both let me introduce the experiment that they conducted. Imagine a group of Chinese guys trying to learn Armenian, and we are giving them sentences in Armenian, and in parallel, we provide them with interpretation. Such a sentence: Gyumri is the capital of Armenia. For him, he needs to understand this sentence in his own language. This means his full attention will be concentrated to comprehending this text. In parallel to this particular task, we are issuing the values of trust. Like we may provide true beliefs, true judgments, or false judgments. As a result of experiment, something very interesting is suggested. persons who learn a language are more inclined to comprehend when we are giving them a second task where they need to evaluate whether the information they have received is true or false. The probability of truth is higher than the probability of being false. Even when the judgment was false, they would most probably claim that the judgment was true, because from the starting point, they are more inclined to comprehend and to perceive the information the way they are presented with it. Even with regard to the sentence of that Gyumri is the capital of Yerevan, they would simply accept it as a truth, unless they are quite specifically interested in some more of the details of it. So they are provided with initial information, they accept and comprehend it without analyzing it. This hypothesis, which Gilbert used, based on anti-reductionism, it was being criticized by Thomas Reid and Daniel Gilbert, and they would say that we accept this information by our mental system if that information complies with our interests and motives of that particular moment. So in such case, people are inclined to analyze the information and even reject it, so far as we are interested or motivated in it. So the moment we get this interest, we would be vigilant towards this information by analyzing it or even by rejecting it. So the seemingly, let me formulate the question: whether does the trust exclude vigilance? There might be 2 points in this. In the first case of blind trust, people are by default trusting and are inclined to analyze the information only in cases when they have some clear signs of it. And there is this contextual trust hypothesis saying that vigilance and trust are not contradicting each other. Contradicting are vigilance and blind or trust by default.
Ես ներողություն եմ խնդրում, ինձ մոտ կապը ընդհատվեց, ձեզ մոտ ամեն բան կարգին էր։ Շատ լավ, ես ներողություն եմ խնդրում։
So, if we speak about trust by default, then yes, we do have a conflict with vigilance. Sperber is asserting that if we are vigilant, we may not be trustful if we do not manifest adequate vigilance. These 2 processes walk hand in hand. Therefore, the hypothesis of epistemic trust and vigilance is being developed, and trust should be based exclusively on active epistemic vigilance. Another important chapter in the article relates to comprehension and acceptance, about the interrelation between these processes. So, what is the role of vigilance in these 2 processes? In the process of comprehension, where we have 2 interlocutors having the objective of being understood. The communicator is transmitting the information, and his or her key purpose is to be understood, comprehended. But that is not sufficient, because if it is simply, it is not just information transmission, but a transmission which implies also communication, then the communicator has other objective as well, not only to have his transmission accept it, but also to incite trust. In this particular case, the question arises, what is the interrelation between the definitions of comprehension and acceptance? Since it is apparent that to be accepted, you need to comprehend, but whether comprehension implies also acceptance, this is a question. The hypothesis I spoke about, Gilbert's experiment I talked about, witnessed, and actually Gilbert was inferring that yes, when I'm transmitting information and when the information is comprehended, it is being accompanied by the process of acceptance, because people understand not only the language, but do accept the given sentence as a truth. Therefore, Gilbert believes that these processes are either simultaneously or coincide, but Sperber says no. These concepts do not reconcile. Even comprehension, even though comprehension is important for acceptance, these processes, something comprehended is acceptable only when it is an important piece of information for the addressee and it aligns with his or her interests. Straightforwardly saying, if we are dealing with the first option or the approach by Gilbert, the level of vigilance there is quite weak. Because if you are immediately inclined to comprehend and accept at the same time, you don't manage to analyze the information and demonstrate some vigilance. But as Sperber says, comprehension is the primary level. You need to have vigilance in order to be able to accept that piece of information. We all do have this skepticism with regard to the information shared with us. To understand where the problem lies, the author recommends differentiating between vigilance towards sources and vigilance towards content. So in the first case, the question is whom to trust. Here, the recommendation is to have two approaches of trust. Common trust, which infers from that blind trust, when you trust a human being irrespective of anything. For example, when you have this general understanding that Mary is trustworthy to trust, then whatever Mary would be doing or saying, we are still thinking that she is trustful because we have this general trust in her. Sperber and his colleagues assert that general trust is incomplete and it is always contextual. Trust is something which is defined case by case. If Mary is a specialist in criminal law, she can be trusted with that aspect, but not with questions related to winemaking, because she is not a specialist there. And here, Sperber is recommending or suggesting two important values to evaluate information. One is vigilance. One is competence. And this means that they should be providing the right information in the right manner. And the second case is when the information is shared in a kind-hearted manner. So he says that somebody may be competent in one sphere and incompetent in another one, or be kind-hearted in one context and just the vice versa in another context. Therefore, the level of trust shown always depends on the sector, audience, and context. The general hypothesis of trust or proposition of trust is being criticized by the psychologists from another perspective, where they say that human behavior is mostly contingent upon the situation rather than their traits. To assert that someone is trustful would be wrong. Sperber is offering some type of protection for this hypothesis, saying that some people may be more trustworthy than others, but this is again relative trust formed as a result of reputation developed through actions in the past. This might be taken into consideration as something general, but not as something absolute. So, the second aspect is how to evaluate or assess the content of information, what to trust. And the question is whether the trustworthiness or reliability of the content of information straightforwardly depends on the reliability of the source of information. Sperber would say no, because in some cases, the content of information may be trustworthy or reliable, or even in cases when the communicator has low level of reliability. For instance, in case of mathematical or reasoning, when you communicate well-known truths. And the contrary is also true when someone who is reliable is disseminating evident disinformation by violating the rules of reasoning, and so forth. Even more so, in case of information, as already mentioned, if we are dealing with prominent truths, mathematical axioms, it's very easy to verify the information. But what to do in cases when we are dealing with unknown situations, and we have to understand, first of all, comprehend the information and then take some actions. What to do in these particular cases? Sperber is asserting that in such cases, the vigilance towards information is assessed based on individual approaches. There are three types of contextual effects whereby it is possible to reconcile the general information with the individual approaches. The first one is contextual new belief, where the new information and the person's contextual belief mutually imply each other, and they infer a new belief. In this particular case, we don't have any ground not to trust the information. And based on this, we do develop another belief. And there is also another aspect, re-evaluation or revaluation, and reforming the belief. And the third one is revisiting the belief, when the new information might be in contradiction with the person's contextual belief, thereby creating a need to revisit it. We may also have a problem with regard to the third instance, what to do when there is a conflict between the new information and the person's beliefs. According to Sperber, there are three potential scenarios or ways out. The first way out is when the information source is not reliable. It can be rejected by qualifying it as untrustworthy or unreliable. For example, when a drunk man says that there is an elephant in the corner of the street, definitely it cannot be reliable. The second is when the information source is belongs to someone, has the copyright, so to say, and that belief needs to be changed. For example, look at John. He believes that he is 22, but he should qualify as higher. And there was a third one when the reliability towards the source of information and towards own belief is equal. In this particular case, the addressee needs to revisit his first two beliefs. In this case, you have the belief that John is a doctor. Mary claims that John is 22 years old, and you well know that 22 years old is too young an age to be a medical doctor. To ensure the coherence between these two beliefs, you need to revisit any one of them or reject one of them or depart with one of them. So your belief that John is a doctor needs to be revisited or changed. And therefore, Sperber asserts that in dealing with the content of information, coherence is an important precondition. The information transmitted should align with the personal beliefs of the addressee. Sperber believes that coherence is a very important factor here. I think there is a question here. Whether we have the preconditions for epistemic vigilance, or these preconditions are acquired. According to psychological research, 16-month-old child they are not gullible, and at that moment, children do notice when the word they know is not used for its purpose. A 2-year-old child generally corrects and revisits the propositions he or she believes wrong. At age of 3, children love people who are competently transmitting information. At the age of 4, the children have their own understanding of reliability, and at the age of 5, children become very vigilant towards fraud, deceit, and self-deception. So this age development, with development, they do acquire age-related cognition, and they can develop various elements. They are able to differentiate weak and strong utterances. They are able to compare the sources of information and select the ones more reliable for them. Children may even demonstrate interest in epistemic utterances, and they even may manipulate of things. And Sperber also believes that the children develop the mind-reading ability. They know that others may have wrong understanding and approaches and would like others to accept such wrong understanding, whereas at 4 years of age, they do demonstrate high level of vigilance while avoiding the situation of being a victim of disinformation. So if we take into account all this data given, as well as psychological research data, we do need to hope that there is some level of vigilance in humans from early age, and then the author tries to see the interconnection between epistemic vigilance and intellect by saying intelligence, he means reasoning. And here, there are two profiles or postures. One is the rejecting one, and the other one is the vigilant one. When in the second case, you analyze the information, and only after having corresponding counter arguments, you either accept or reject the information. Sperber says that for any communicator, it is preferable to deal with vigilant persons or persons with vigilant posture, because in that case, they may use reasoning techniques to have the information acceptable. In this case, Sperber is making a reference to Chris's work. He says that the following: Andy says that Steve seems not to have a partner. Barbara claims that Steve visits New York quite frequently. In this particular case, Barbara is using a concealed or healed syllogism, because if she would in the beginning claim that Steve has a partner, it would have contradicted Andy's belief, and in that case, Andy would reject it. But when she is proposing an additional theory to Andy, she gives the opportunity to Andy to infer on his own that Steve has a partner. And because our information is to persuade when transmitting information, we may use this type of trick, and the communicator may succeed in this particular case, depending on the goal. In this particular case, argumentation is a tool not only for epistemic vigilance, but also in terms of making the information comprehensible and acceptable for the addressee. And the last part of the article is about the following. Actually, by now we were trying to understand whether the level of individual, which are the preconditions for vigilance, which are the values enabling to deal with information, and the question arises whether in a group, in a community, in a public, how can we speak about, or whether we can speak about public or epistemic vigilance. In order to discuss this provision, Sperber is defining cultural information, according to which the information that is being spread in the public through social interactions is called cultural. For example, dissemination of religious beliefs is, and he believes that it implies culture. Communication implies cultural interaction, and he is asking whether persons, when transmitting cultural information, are they sufficiently vigilant? He is also making an interesting reference about about epistemic vigilance at level of the group. In small groups, it's very easy to verify the source of information as well as the content. But in larger communities, larger groups, the level of epistemic vigilance is quite low, because first of all, it is very difficult to identify the source. And in larger public and in larger communities, the mechanisms of transmission and acceptance of information are different. To understand this mechanism, the author is suggesting us to take these two aspects. One is information that is being transferred by reputable persons. Persons have respect towards such persons, and they do develop the so-called blind trust towards them, and or maybe it might be a religious understanding, or mysterious ideas. And in such situations, public generally develops blind trust and the contradiction arises because at the level of individual persons do demonstrate some vigilance, but when the same people are deemed as an integral part or smaller particles of a larger community, under certain mechanisms, they might lower their level of vigilance. And the question arises as to how group vigilance can be developed. What are the mechanisms whereby we can build community level or group level epistemic vigilance? The author believes that Sperber believes that because there are different social sectors and institutions, they create their own mechanisms for building epistemic vigilance towards corresponding information. For example, in research and development agencies, in institutions which are producing scientific product, it is very important to develop vigilance towards the role of discussions, conferences, and publications. You know, the public has this function of self-regulation. Any sector related to the society or public generally creates its own mechanisms for vigilance or mechanisms for making the field verifiable, where we might hope that at the level of the group, we can show some vigilance. This much from my side. Thank you for being so patient with me, for bearing with me, because I think it was a little bit long for one presentation. I'm now happy to take any questions you may have, and